Civilization has depended on critical or strategic minerals for most of history, and at some times more than others. One of those times was during the Second World War. Part of what made it a truly global conflict was mineral resources: who had them, who didn't have them, who acquired them, who lost them. Somewhere in the chain of producing and using and fighting over metals and fuels, almost every nation on Earth was involved. Over the course of the war, control of mineral resources would swing back and forth as large fractions of the world's geology changed hands. But in the end, one result was clear. In modern warfare, whichever side was better equipped for possession and production of mineral resources had definite, sometimes insurmountable, strategic advantages. It was the end of a bloody lesson that the world had spent 3 decades learning. In 1914, armies and governments across Europe had careened into the First World War thinking that fighting spirit was the only natural resource that mattered. They spent the next 4 years beginning to understand the material requirements of conflict between industrialized nations. By 1918, with the heroics exhausted but the artillery still going, nobody who was left ignored the role of oil, coal, and metals in fighting. For a brief while afterward, it seemed that war had ended for all time. An American government committee compiled a list of 28 minerals and other materials that had encountered supply difficulties during the war, but little other action was taken amid the general wish to forget. A relieved but exhausted world partied its way through the 1920s, trying not to think about what another war might cost. As 1930 rolled around, the party came to an end. Depression, disillusion, and embitterment set in. A vicious cycle began with mineral resources at the center. Militaristic passions rose, military expansion placed new demands on heavy industries. Industry demanded more mineral resources to make machinery, munitions, and steel. In a worldwide environment of depressed home economies, high tariffs, and closed markets, those resources ran short. The shortage stimulated calls to seize them by whatever means necessary, causing more resource-intensive military manufacturing that made the shortages worse. Amid the Depression, dictators rose to power, claiming that their people were being starved of money, honor, and pride by oppressive forces scheming to keep them in subjection. To restore national self-esteem was imperative, and it would need mineral resources in proportion to a nation's industrial capacity and imperial ambitions. In Germany, the call was for Lebensraum, which meant room to live in and resources to live on in a manner befitting an industrialized nation of the first rank. In Japan, army generals who feared an imminent potential shortage of coal, oil, and iron created a real one by demanding huge expansions of military capacity. Then they called for war and conquest to alleviate the shortage. And the fascisti looked around them and saw more than 90% of Italy's raw materials reaching them across a Mediterranean that Britain dominated, resented Woodrow Wilson's thwarting of Italy's attempts to acquire a colonial empire in Africa, and felt uncomfortably dependent on another nation's goodwill. Philosophies of autarky, or national self-reliance with regard to raw materials, took hold. Since the First World War, most national governments had known what resources were at issue. They varied with the country's geological endowments of minerals, but in general, the list of strategic mineral resources, so termed because it would be impossible to carry on a modern war without them, included oil for fuel, coal, in particular the high-quality coking or metallurgical coal used to make steel, iron, the main ingredient in steel, copper, vital to anything electrical, aluminum, the principal metal used in making aircraft, and the family of ferroalloy elements used to make super hard and strong armor, gun, and tool steels, especially nickel, manganese, chrome, molybdenum, cobalt, and tungsten. The steel in tank and battleship armor, for instance, ranged from 1 to 3% chromium, about 1% manganese and nickel, and often more, and a few tenths of a percent molybdenum at various times. Cobalt, if available, could add further hardness and strength. Gun steels required yet higher amounts of nickel, chrome, and other ferroalloys, and it took a tungsten cap to make a shell armor piercing. So, fully armed, a single tank could need well over a ton of ferroalloys mixed into tens of tons of iron, to say nothing of the copper for its motor and electrical wiring. One battleship took 2 million pounds of copper and thousands of tons of alloy steels. And then there was oil. Moving a typical armored battalion a distance of 100 miles required 17,000 gallons of fuel. Other metals and minerals were also necessary to war, but lower demand, greater domestic resources, the ready availability of substitutes, and/or a more diverse range of global supplies made them less critical and therefore of lower concern. But the ferroalloys in particular were vital. Armaments constructed with plain carbon steel facing opponents equipped with alloy steel might as well have been made out of wood. All industrial powers and wannabes needed these mineral resources, but Mother Nature had distributed them around the world with a parsimonious and unequal hand. Some nations felt the geological injustice more keenly than others. Charles Leith, an economic geologist advising the Roosevelt administration, reflected this when he divided the world into the have nations that controlled mineral producing lands and the have nots whose domestic mineral resource base could never come close to supporting an industrialized economy. The have-nots ranged from mostly to completely dependent on the haves for mineral resources, but even haves like the United States did not have everything. America was a major exporter of oil, copper, and molybdenum in the 1930s and produced plenty of iron and coal, but imported 90% of its chromium, 86% of its manganese, 61% of its tungsten, and the entirety of its nickel and aluminum from abroad. Absent these metals, as Leith put it, if all our imports were cut off, our industry would indeed return to the horse and buggy days. We could build neither an automobile nor a battleship. If America would have been back to the horse and buggy, most of the have-nots would have been hard-pressed to find enough metal to shoe the horse with. In the 1930s, the US and the British Empire between them controlled some 75% of the world's mineral resources, compared to about 11% for Germany, Italy, and Japan put together. Much of the remainder was in the Soviet Union, which at that time included some of the world's largest iron and manganese deposits in Ukraine, as well as oil fields in the Caucasus. In oil, the distribution was still more lopsided, with the Germans, Japanese, and Italians in cumulative possession of a mere 3% of the world's producing regions. These principal have-nots, with industrial economies that needed vastly more resources than their geology could supply, were soon to become the Axis powers. Of them, Italy was probably the worst off. It produced about 2/3 of its annual demand for lead, 1/4 of its annual iron, measly amounts of oil, copper, and coal, and not an ounce of ferroalloy metals or aluminum. Japan's situation in 1930 was not much better. The home islands contained enough coal and copper to meet demand, but almost nothing else. Import dependence was over 2/3 for iron, well over 90% for oil, and nearly total for aluminum and the ferroalloys. None of the coal was high quality, a problem that would come back to haunt the Japanese during the war. And Germany, out of all the strategic mineral resources, had self-sufficiency in exactly one: coal. The reasons why were still a cause of bitterness. Stripped of resource-rich lands in the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had gone from 92% self-sufficient in iron before 1918 to 67% import dependent afterwards. Without Western Poland, copper production amounted to less than 14% of demand, and domestic mines of ferroalloys and aluminum were non-existent. The lack of iron and ferroalloys was a sore point for a nation whose crown jewels had long included its advanced steel industry. A great industry and a great nation, it was felt, were being frustrated by the inferiority of the geological resources available. The mismatch between ambitions and resources came to a head first in Japan, where economic depression had hit early and hard and militarists were already in power. By 1930, senior Japanese military officers were publicly calling for Japan to invade Manchuria and Mongolia at once, saying that their iron ore and coal resources could save the nation from imminent industrial crisis. The next year, the Japanese did invade Manchuria, quickly seizing its iron and coal mines. The rest of the world, amid the shock of the Great Depression, noticed that the search for mineral resources was breaking down the global order. The League of Nations sanctioned Japan. Japan walked out of the League of Nations, and there was again a little talk among the haves of doing something to ensure strategic minerals security, but little else. 2 years later, the Nazis arrived at power in Germany with a program of rebuilding the nation, economy, industry, armaments, pride, and all. The Minister for Economics, Hjalmar Schacht, argued that the world's mineral and fuel resources must be more equitably redistributed. The Reich insisted as a minimum that Germany must at least be given back its resource-rich African colonies or else be a source of unrest for the world. The Nazi government did not wait for the world to negotiate. They began preparing for war. So did Japan, hearing the American public murmur about the Japanese occupying Manchuria with American oil and iron, hearing the American government murmur about embargoes. President Roosevelt formed the National Resources Board to examine America's strategic mineral supplies in the event of a war. But while the haves talked and examined, the have-nots prepared. No one was ready for a war yet in 1933 and 34, so preparations were quiet. Both Germany and Japan called in their old silver and copper alloy coins and reissued their coinages in pure nickel. The old coins were still perfectly functional, and the new nickel pieces cost a good bit more to make, but unlike silver, they could be called back in and made into nickel steel for guns and battleship armor. More than 90% of the world's nickel at the time came from Canada and New Caledonia, part of the British and French empires respectively, and the Axis nations were not taking chances. Besides using their cash as a discrete ferroalloy stockpile, the have-not nations sought other ways to accumulate the minerals they were increasingly expecting to need. One way was through the international mining business. A Japanese mining company began buying up nickel mining concessions in New Caledonia starting in 1933, and a German company would follow its example in 1936. Mining started on what pitiful domestic nickel resources Germany had, encouraged by state subsidies, but still operable only at severe losses and producing about 5% of what was needed. Technology offered a more promising route, at least for oil. Even before Hitler became chancellor, he was meeting with the directors of the German chemical company IG Farben to encourage them to expand the production of synthetic oil from coal using a chemical process developed too late to make a difference in the First World War. He promised them subsidies and made good on his word. German domestic oil production rose throughout the 1930s without a well being drilled. Efforts to boost resource self-reliance also embraced the demand side. In 1934, Germany prohibited the use of certain metals, including copper and some of the ferroalloys, in residential construction and other civilian purposes, reserving their limited supplies for rearmament. Meanwhile, German metallurgists worked to develop weapons and armor that could be manufactured from mineral resources with at least somewhat less vulnerability. Steels once based on nickel and cobalt were switched to chrome and manganese alloys as much as possible. Germany still had to import all of its chrome and manganese, but from the Soviet Union and the Balkans rather than from the British and the French, and instead of being oceans away, the mines were within reach of a few weeks' blitzkrieg. Through 1934, the German and Japanese governments continued to insist with straight faces that their efforts to curb demand and boost supply of strategic minerals were purely peaceful, and that coins had been remade in nickel for the sole purpose of beautifying the currency. They fooled no one. A Wall Street Journal headline from March 1933 blared, "Japan plans nickel coins for war." Other industrialized nations began to get nervous and look to their own situations. In 1934, America's Army and Navy Munitions Board recommended spending a whopping $100 million, more than $2 billion today, to stockpile imported ferroalloy elements. That defensive move did not happen for political reasons. What did happen was perhaps more geared toward offensive maneuvering. The US progressively began to restrict its exports of scrap metal and other resources, with emphasis on cutting down sales to Japan and Germany. First, these were placed under new licensing requirements from the State Department, and then quantities and material types were gradually restricted. Britain, fearing that any gains in mineral resources by the have-nots would come at the expense of its empire, sponsored a League of Nations Committee of Inquiry to evaluate equality of commercial access to raw materials for all nations, pointedly excluding the possibility of what Schacht had termed territorial adjustments. The Germans and Italians boycotted the inquiry, and most of the rest of the world, including the United States, dismissed it as window dressing by the British government. But the US and the French and British empires still had not started any domestic stockpiles of strategic minerals. The Soviet Union, bouncing between famine, repression, and the beginnings of the Great Purge, had none either. From 1935 to 1936, the world was still half hoping for peace while preparing for war, when fantasies of national resource self-sufficiency began to overflow national boundaries. The have-nots were now out in the open seeking resources by any means necessary. The fig leaf of civilian purposes withered. In 1935, Italy's fascists informed the world that East Africa contained mountains of iron ore and launched an invasion of Abyssinia. The League of Nations sanctioned Italy, and Canada embargoed its nickel. Italy responded by making autarky from an unofficial aim to an official policy. In 1936, Germany took over the Saarland and the Rhineland and promulgated a 4-year economic plan aimed toward autarky. Hitler proclaimed, "In 4 years, Germany must be completely independent of foreign countries so far as concerns those materials which we are capable of obtaining ourselves in any way with our chemical and engineering industries and our own mining industry." Meanwhile, his government bought all the manganese and chrome that the Soviets would sell, and received in stockpiled shipments of tungsten, copper, and other metals mined in Asia and transshipped on Soviet railroads. An iron supply from Sweden was secured by treaty. With the Franco government's blessing, German mining companies began to edge the British out of Spain's tungsten deposits and Spanish Moroccan iron. Farther east, the Japanese began to feel Manchuria and its resources too small and planned an expansion into China itself. Expecting this would lead to an oil embargo from America, the Japanese Navy sponsored research towards a coal-to-oil conversion program with heavy subsidies and stocked up on as much petroleum as the US and the Dutch East Indies would sell them in the meantime. By 1938, the open stockpiling of strategic minerals and munitions, now happening on all sides, was the least belligerent of the activities going on. Hitler proclaimed that Germany was no longer just a nation but an empire, and set out to acquire the foreign possessions that would merit the name. First Austria, joined to Germany by Anschluss, then the Sudetenland on the edges of Czechoslovakia. In March of 1939, the Nazi Empire swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia. The sight of this expansion was enough to make Stalin's government, resting uneasy to the east, rush to placate Hitler with measures Neville Chamberlain might have blushed at. Having spent the late 1930s purging his army of treason, counter-revolution, and ability, Stalin suddenly realized that he had no real way of holding off Hitler's tanks if the Nazis chose to conquer resources rather than buying them. He rushed extra shipments of ferroalloys and copper to the Germans on favorable terms. It was fortunate for him that at that point Germany already anticipated war in the West and was more eager to secure ferroalloys than to open a second front. In August of 1939, the Nazi-Soviet pact alleviated concerns on both sides. Stalin even gave Hitler a signing bonus, Manganese exports that had earlier gone to the United States were redirected to Germany instead. American metallurgists, beginning to panic, started experimenting with steels that substituted less manganese with more molybdenum, an element mined in abundance in Colorado and Arizona. So the eve of war found two of the three Axis powers preparing to fight a war in which they would start out at a profound disadvantage in strategic minerals. Trade treaties would ensure the continued availability of iron, chrome, copper, manganese, and tungsten in Germany. Domestic coal mining would supply raw material for conversion to oil. A few early conquests were expected to bolster supplies, and they had learned to do without much nickel apart from stockpiles, minimal imports and mining, and what they could get back from coinage. In Japan, stockpiles were being built up, research was starting into coal to oil conversion. The iron mines of Manchuria and northern China were boosting production at gunpoint, and plans were in motion for early conquests of oil and ferroalloy elements in French Indochina, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan's situation was precarious, and wartime success depended on rapid early conquest of mineral-rich lands from the distracted British and French empires. Only Italy, ever the weak link of the Axis, was on its way to being caught flat-footed. The iron deposits of Abyssinia had not been as advertised, and Mussolini had omitted to consider that an iron supply required not only iron ore deposits, but mining engineers, which Italy scarcely had. The oil fields discovered in Italian Libya in the 1930s were genuine. In fact, they were world class, but Italy had no petroleum engineers either, and the fascisti refused to import them. Almost throughout the war, Mussolini would continue buying oil from Romania rather than admit to needing foreign help in technology. And so the stage was set for a war in which the have-nots would try to improve their own mineral resource supplies by dispossessing the haves.